When Elizabeth died in 1603, she had no heirs, and the House of Tudor came to an end. And so the chief ministers of England turned then to the House of Stuart, which is the ruling house of Scotland that traces itself all the way back through Robert the Bruce, the famous king from Braveheart, who is very badly misrepresented there, shall we say. But on the Scottish throne sat 37-year-old James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the great-great-grandson of King Henry VII of England. He was separated from his mother when just a baby and never saw her again. He became King of Scotland when he was just 13 months old. When he accepted the crown of England, he also became James I of England. Now, this is again a time of great instability in England, and one of the first things that confronts James when he takes the throne is what is known as the Gunpowder Plot, also called the Jesuit treason. This was a failed assassination attempt of the king and a failed attempt to blow up Parliament, although there were numerous conspirators. The most famous of these is Guy Fawkes, whose mask and story is featured in the movie V for Vendetta, and he was the one given the charge of the explosives. Well, the plot was foiled, and Fawkes and his fellow surviving conspirators were hanged, drawn, and quartered. And the reason it is called the Jesuit treason is that the leading Jesuit of England, Father Henry Garnet, knew of the plot, but learned of it under the seal of the confessional. When he would not give away the other details because of the seal of the confessional, he was executed. This also, of course, gave rise to Guy Fawkes Day. Hey, a penny for the old guy, on November the 5th, which people would go around asking for a penny so they could buy fireworks and so forth and celebrate Guy Fawkes Day. And of course, there is the poem, Remember, remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I can think of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. As a result of this plot and the growing hatred of Protestants for the Catholic Church and their great fear of it, and for the other non-conforming religions, a series of penal laws were passed. The penal laws deprived Catholics, Puritans, Quakers, fringe groups like this of the right to vote, the right to hold property, the right to hold public office. It even could throw them in prison at times. When James died in 1625, his son Charles succeeded him as Charles I of England. Now, although a Scot by birth, he spent very little time in Scotland. He was a proponent of absolutism. That is, he said he had the divinely ordained right of kings. And so he became King of England, Scotland, and Ireland with a very, shall we say, problematic attitude toward a people that are really starting to question the role of the divine right of kings, or the eligibility of the divine right of kings, or the validity of the divine right of kings. He also began to turn the Anglican Church more toward the Roman Church, which we call High Church. And this angered and alienated numerous people in his realm, including notable members of both the House of Lords and the House of Commons. When he married a Roman Catholic, Henrietta Maria of France, who was so devout that she would not even attend Charles's official coronation because it was a Protestant ceremony, people became even more worried. Now, one of Charles's attempts to bring more control over religion, and what got people pissed off, involved of handling what was called the Kirk. The Kirk is the Church of Scotland, which was very Presbyterian in its leading. Kirk is a Gaelic term, or a Gaelic Scottish term for church. Charles tried to impose high church practices, such as formal religious practices, resistance to modernization, giving a great deal of power to the bishops, and so forth. And this went against the wishes of many in Scotland who called themselves Covenanters. And they signed a declaration, or national covenant, and resisted the high church changes. This resulted in what were called the Bishops' Wars, as Covenanters wanted ministers and elders to run their churches rather than bishops. Well, as things began to grow hotter and more antagonistic between Charles and Parliament, Charles dissolved Parliament 3 times and then simply ruled without a Parliament, as long as he could avoid war, though. And this period came to be known as the period of personal rule, and it lasted for 11 years. And so they went 11 years without calling a single session of Parliament, which at this time was still considered to be more of an advisory body than really a legislative body. Let's talk about Parliament for a bit. The first Parliament in England was convened in 1215 with the signing of the Magna Carta between King John and the nobles, and it included at first the barons, the nobles, and then over time the bishops and constituents from the counties and towns. Eventually, Parliament split into the 2 houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And those who represented in the House of Commons were called burgesses, and that's one of the reasons why Virginia's legislature was known early on as the House of Burgesses. It addressed taxation, grievances, and gradually over time limited the power of the crown bit by bit until what you see today in Great Britain is a monarch that has no actual power other than ceremonial and advisory power. Now, by the time the Stuarts came to rule, Parliament had become dominated by Calvinist reformers whom we call Puritans. And they were called Puritans because they literally attempted to purify the religion of the church by taking out statuary, stained glass, religious images, and so forth. Obviously, Puritans were adamantly, vehemently, viciously opposed to Catholicism. They tended, of course, to support the Protestants in the 30 Years' War. They were highly resistant to new taxes. If you want to understand how it is in this country that we hate taxes so much, all you have to do is look at the Puritans of England and know that they are the ones that came over here eventually and brought their hatred of taxes with them. They placed upon the king what was known as the Petition of Right, which declares that subjects have certain rights and liberties, fair taxes, protection against unlawful imprisonment, protection from billeting soldiers in homes. Does any of this sound familiar? It should. You're seeing the foundation of our own Bill of Rights coming about. When war again finally comes to Britain, Charles convened what was known as the Short Parliament in 1640. This lasted only 3 weeks and was a disaster because its speaker, Sir John Glanville, whom you see in the beautiful red robes there, could not bring any tax discussion to the floor. The members instead wished to complain about the king the whole time. And so Charles got fed up and dissolved it. But he couldn't tax the people. So he has to call Parliament into session again. The new body then passes a resolution that it will not dissolve again except by the agreement of the members. And thus it comes to be known as the Long Parliament because it does not dissolve until 1660. That's a 20-year parliament. Many believe that the work and principles of the Long Parliament are what set the stage for the American Revolution. In order to even consider the taxes, Charles was presented with what was known as the Grand Remonstrance, which was a list of 150 misdeeds Parliament claimed the Catholic Church had perpetrated through the king's wife, and demanding that the king purge all the bishops from Parliament. Now, what one sees in all this debate is the fact that Parliament, from this point forward, becomes a more permanent and substantial body, and power begins to trickle into both government and religion. And that is the notion of individual liberty, rather than submission to crown-appointed bishops, or worse, bishops of Rome, bishops from Rome. What we're also seeing, therefore, is the beginning of the separation of church and state. Charles refused to even acknowledge the Grand Remonstrance and became even more recalcitrant in his dealing with Parliament. And that led to the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651. Now, historians will say there's a first English Civil War and a second English Civil War in there, and okay, that's fine. but it's really all part of one big war, and it's part of what is known as the War of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, England, Ireland, and Scotland. Now, the sides line up, and those on the side of the king are called Cavaliers. And they had a lot of supporters in the Virginia colony of North America, hence the name for the University of Virginia mascot. On the other side were the supporters of Parliament, called the Roundheads, because of the hats they wore. One member of this group was John Milton, the famous poet who gave us Paradise Lost, of the fall of Lucifer as he becomes Satan. Now, the first clashes of the war happen after Charles begins to throw many Puritans in prison. Now, many of the Puritans felt that England was too corrupt anyway to create the perfect Christian life, so they instead packed up and set forth for a place where they could create a perfect Christian community with a tabula rasa, with a clear and open land. And that would, of course, be Massachusetts, which was certainly not a tabula rasa, but that's another story for another class. Now, the war would be fought according to what was called the pike and shot formations, in which soldiers armed with pikes or spears defended riflemen in tight formation, where there were three levels of firing. There's the laying down riflemen, the kneeling riflemen, and the standing riflemen. In the First War, Charles foolishly leaves London for the countryside. He abandons his main arsenal, he abandons his city, because he felt that the real support he had was in the countryside. But he was defeated and captured. And when he's captured, then he starts trying to play sides against the other. And this is what really gets him in trouble. Now, in the Second War, many start changing sides. And villages and towns throughout England were attacked. Many of the villages and towns saw the English Civil War going on. They all basically said, just leave us out of it. Y'all go fight out in the fields and leave us alone. But in the second part of the war, the villages and towns are now being brought into it. And eventually, Oliver Cromwell had to push a Scottish army out of England to put Charles back on the throne. Not that Cromwell wanted Charles back on the throne. The Scots were invading to put Charles back on the throne. At this point, Cromwell and the army took Charles prisoner, and then they placed him on trial for treason. Here is a map that shows the sections of England that's favored Parliament and favored the king throughout the English Civil War. Now, on either side, the armies numbered probably around 15 to 20,000 each. This was not massive armies destroying the countryside like the 30 Years' War. Nonetheless, there was a little bit of destruction as a result of this war. Now, the man who engineered the trial and then execution of Charles was Oliver Cromwell. Now, Cromwell was a moderate parliamentarian. We don't know much about him during his first 40 years of life. He had very few letters or anything left over. But he became the leader of the Ironsides, or the Puritan faction. That's where he gets his name, Old Ironsides. And he becomes a unifying force in Parliament at a time when there was little unifying anything in England. And one of the things that really made him a good unifier is that he was a very capable general on the field. This is a time of great religious upheaval in England. You have plenty of splinter factions breaking off from the Protestant mainstream Anglicans. Of course, you already have the Calvinist Puritans, but you also had Quakers, known as the Society of Friends, in northwestern England and Wales, and you had the Baptists that are also beginning to raise their heads here, and the Methodists are not far down the road. Cromwell turns on these factions and begins to purge them out of Parliament as well. And so by the time the trial of Charles comes about, Cromwell and the army had purged Parliament of most of its members for all of its fighting, leaving only what was called the rump Parliament, because there was only a little bit of the rear end of the Parliament left. That's what you call it whenever a legislative body has been purged. What's left is a rump Parliament or a rump legislature. The rump Parliament then tries and convicts Charles I, and Charles refuses to give any evidence in his favor or participate in the trial because he says, "You do not have the right to do this. I am the king." That's it. Well, Parliament says you can go ahead and claim whatever you want. They sentenced Charles to death in 1649 for conspiring with the numerous factions, and they behead him. Now, regicide is a pretty drastic step, and it represents a point of no return for those who bring it about. Now, regicide can be both frightening, but it also can be emboldening. Cromwell, now realizing that he has crossed his Rubicon, so to speak, goes on the march. He unifies England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland through violence. And it was Ireland that caught it particularly savagely, as Cromwell massacred people who allied themselves with the king's faction. The name of Cromwell in Ireland is not well regarded. And here is the ultimate irony of the whole Civil War in England, is that all of these numerous campaigns in Scotland, Wales, and in Ireland brought on the need for more taxes in England. And this was the very thing that sparked the war in the first place. Charles's desire to tax the people. This is an artist's depiction of the trial of Charles I. Charles, when he was brought into the chamber, immediately challenged the very legality of the trial. I would know by what power I am called hither. I would know by what authority. I mean lawful authority. Well, you're starting to see here now the breakdown of absolutism in England. And there is old Ironsides himself, Oliver Cromwell. This is an artist's depiction of Cromwell viewing the deceased Charles after he had been beheaded. His head was put back to his body in the casket and then interned in Westminster Abbey. The king is on one side of Westminster Abbey, Cromwell on the other. Cromwell, now staunchly in the Puritan camp, established England as a republican commonwealth. Several times he was offered the crown, but he refused it, almost as if he was trying to reinvent himself as Caesar. Meanwhile, Charles I's sons, Charles and younger brother James, the Duke of York, fled to France with their families and awaited a turn of events. In England, Parliament continued to resist new taxes and fought among itself so much that on the 20th of April in 1653, Cromwell storms into Parliament with 40 musketeers and supposedly said, "You are no Parliament. I say you are no Parliament. I will put an end to your sitting." And he drove them all out. Cromwell has now dissolved the Rump Parliament, and what he establishes in its place is what is known as the Protectorate. He became a virtual king and dictator, and put a great deal of effort into healing and settling the religious and sectarian disputes that were going on. He also undertook a great deal of spiritual and moral reform. A lot of the fun things that Englishmen like to do, like the theater, was closed down. Cromwell also issued several injunctions against the Jews in England as well. Cromwell died in 1658, and with his death, the realm was once again thrown into political turmoil because his son Richard Cromwell, although capable and intelligent, was very much an ineffective ruler because he simply did not have the contacts and the relationships that his father had with members of Parliament. He also did not have the loyalty that his father commanded. And so after less than a year, the Rump Parliament reconvened and said, "Thank you, you may now leave your position." At this point, an army invaded from Scotland, took control of London, and allowed the purged members of Parliament back in, who then held the first parliamentary elections in 20 years. And this resulted in what was called the Convention Parliament. And this Convention Parliament now turns to the 29-year-old Charles II, and he was invited to return as king in 1660. Now, what made it easy for his return was first the Declaration of Breda, in which he promises religious tolerance for just about everybody, and he meant to include Catholics. Parliament was not going to let him go that far. He then issues the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, pardoning all the Roundheads except for 50 of the regicides. Only 9, though, would be executed. Then You'll love this. Cromwell and two of the other regicides who had died would be posthumously exhumed, sentenced to beheading, and then their corpses were decapitated and put on pikes until they were finally reinterred. Now Charles is back as king. Charles II is back as king. And he has things to deal with. First of all, he has to deal with the Great Plague of 1665, which was the last outbreak of bubonic plague. We're all rather interested in pandemics these days, and you will see that quarantining, and even some doctors were saying that it might be a good idea not to let other people breathe what you're breathing or exhaling. Some people said, put on a mask. He also had to deal with what was called the Great Fire of 1666. After a long summer of drought, all of London went up, including Shakespeare's own Globe Theatre went up in the Great Fire of 1666. Charles also had to deal with a false conspiracy called the Popish Plot. Don't you love the sound of that? It alleged that there was a cabal of Roman Catholics, led by the Jesuits, of course, conspiring to murder the king. Before the false conspiracy could be debunked, Catholics in London were driven out or persecuted, and 22 people, including Catholic priests, were executed. There was even a search of Parliament for a second gunpowder plot. Eventually, it all fizzled, and the perpetrators were all convicted of perjury. But Roman Catholics in Britain were more likely to be the victims of violence than foment violence themselves. Now, doesn't this sound a great deal familiar to us today about conspiracy theories and wild accusations that even when debunked, people are still going to give it some credence? The period of Charles's return to the throne and his subsequent reign is called the Restoration. It was a period of extreme decadence and frivolity, which followed after the Puritan rules were relaxed, the theaters and the pubs reopened, and so forth. Charles himself had several mistresses. He fathered 12 illegitimate offspring. The late Princess Diana and Princes William and Harry are direct descendants of one of those illegitimate sons. His wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, who was the daughter of the King of Portugal, she had no children, suffered 3 miscarriages. Her Catholicism made her unpopular and the subject of attacks during the Popish Plot. Now, Charles himself ruled as a Protestant, but declared Catholicism on his deathbed. Now, he tried to issue a declaration of indulgence, advocating tolerance for all religion, but Parliament still had enough Puritans in it, and they did not want to include the Catholics, and so they rejected it. Now, when he was in exile in France before the Restoration, Charles became a devout student of science and later supported scientific studies and was one of those who encouraged William Harvey in his study of the circulatory systems. That kind of binds things together. Charles died suddenly at age 54 in 1685. Some people think that he may have been poisoned. We're not sure. We just know that he died at 54, and that was around the average age that nobility passed away. Now, his brother James, the Duke of York, is the only legitimate heir, and so he becomes King James II and James VII of Scotland. Now, James was not the same mold as his brother. He was Catholic in leaning, he was married to a Catholic, and this was tolerated by Parliament because at the time he had no children. And it believed that then his daughters, Anne and Mary, who had married Protestant princes, would eventually inherit the throne. But then his wife gives birth to a male heir named James Francis Edward Stuart. And this means that there's a Catholic heir to the throne. It means that the dynasty of England could be Catholic. And this brings out a constitutional crisis. When 7 bishops are put on trial by James for libel and for speaking out against him and then acquitted, this destroys James's political power, and England is now thrown into a major, major crisis. On the left is the merry monarch himself, Nicknamed Old Raleigh because his sexual appetites were that of a stallion, King Charles II. On the right, his brother, James II. It is after him that the city of New York is named. This constitutional crisis in England resulted in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And it was called the Glorious Revolution because there was no bloodshed in England. Instead, the war would be fought in Ireland with tragic consequences. Now, what existed was a split in Parliament. Some did not even want James to get the throne at first, and they put forth what was known as the Exclusion Bill, and some even sought to confirm the crown on the Protestant Duke of Monmouth, the eldest of Charles's illegitimate children. Now, a large faction in Parliament rose up and said, "We abhor this," and so they were called the Abhorrers. They were called the Tories, after a term for dispossessed Irish Catholic bandits. The Tories supported the hereditary monarchy, and they supported the ceremony of the Anglican Church. On the other side were those that favored the Exclusion Bill, and they were called the Petitioners. The Petitioners eventually come to be known as Whigs, after a term for rebellious Scottish Presbyterians, and this was a mnemonic. We hope in God, not in King. They held to the supremacy of Parliament, and they held to the absolute right of Protestant dissent. It is James's pro-Catholic policies and the birth of a male heir that brings these two factions together for a time, and all of Parliament turns to James's daughter Mary and her husband, who was also her first cousin, and therefore James's cousin, William II. So William II is both James's son-in-law and cousin. Now, William II is the sovereign prince of Orange in the Netherlands. When William agrees to this and lands with an army in England, James, who was a good commander but had a tendency to panic, flees to France, and Parliament installs William as William III of England, with Mary as his wife and queen. This will mark once and for all the end of absolutism in the British monarchy. Known as King Billy to many, William of Orange was married to Mary, the daughter of James, and since he was also in line to the throne, he ruled not as a consort, but as king, and he was known as William III of England. He takes the throne in a bloodless coup, and essentially both he and Parliament declare that since James fled of his own accord, he therefore forfeited the throne. That James, in a sense, abdicated instead of being deposed. Parliament then begins to exclude Catholics in what is known as a Toleration Act, which means that all the other Protestant religions are okay. Catholics, not so much. Now, once Mary died, and then William died after her in 1701, you have another crisis because they don't have any children of their own, so it's going to pass to his sister-in-law, Anne. But James, for his part, flees to France, and there he assembles an army and decides to make his play for the throne again in Ireland. James's supporters are called the Jacobites. They attempt to secure French support and regain Ireland. On July the 11th, 1690, the forces of James meet the forces of William outside the town of Drogheda along the river Boyne at what would be called the Battle of the Boyne. It's William's army, which is called the Orange, or the Orangemen, against James's Greens. It is a victory for William and the Oranges. The Irish Protestants who fought in this actually run from the field. William's Dutch army, who are the support, have to come in and win the day over. But the battle assured William on his throne. James runs back to France. The rest of the Irish Greens retreat to the city of Limerick. And there, after two sieges, William decides to give a very generous treaty called the Treaty of Limerick. And this will allow the Catholics to maintain themselves in Ireland and allow the Maine soldiers to leave Ireland if they wish. Parliament rejects the toleration for Catholics in this treaty and instead enacts a very harsh penal code. And since this is done in the name of the king and Parliament, a very derisive poem is now uttered in Ireland against William of Orange. And it goes like this: up the tall ladder, down the short rope, to hell with King Billy, and long live the Pope. And if that doesn't do, we'll tear him in two and send him to hell with his red, white, and blue. Here is an artist's depiction of William rallying the Orangemen to battle against the Greens on the Boyne. Even to this day, the Orange Orders in what we call Northern Ireland commemorate the Battle of the Boyne on July the 12th, and they call it Marching Day. And they get out their drums and play their songs of victory and go marching through the streets, and their parade route often takes them through Catholic nationalist neighborhoods. So imagine, if you will, the Ku Klux Klan, with whom the Orange Orders have sometimes expressed a little unity and a little fraternal brotherhood. Imagine, if you will, the Klan marching through the middle of a black neighborhood on Juneteenth, so to speak, to try and rub it in the faces of black people. This is exactly what happens today in Northern Ireland, although there have been some negotiations about changing the routes and avoiding all the trouble that had happened in the past. With the death of William, Anne, the sister of Mary, who is married to a Danish prince, now becomes Queen Anne, and she is known as Good Queen Anne. Now, under her reign, the crowns of Scotland and England would join in what was called the Act of Union. Now, historians have differed about Anne and her basic rule. She was derided as fat, constantly pregnant, under the influence of favorites, lacking political astuteness, and yet we look back on this now and we think that this was probably sexism at work against a female ruler. Anne was constantly pregnant. She had 17 pregnancies and none of them made it all the way to term. It left her childless. In order to keep the Catholic Stuarts off the throne, Parliament passes what is known as the Act of Settlement in 1701. It stipulated that claimants to the throne must be Protestant and their spouses must convert to the Anglican Church, which is why Princess Kate gave up being Catholic to marry Prince William, and also why the Queen's husband, the late Prince Philip, who just recently died a few months ago, he was Greek Orthodox. He had to become Anglican. All right, so the Act of Settlement stipulates that Princess Sophia of Hanover, a German princess and the granddaughter of James I, would be the heir presumptive to the throne because she was the closest Protestant in line to the throne. She actually died before Anne did, and so the heir presumptive then falls upon her son, George, and he will eventually become King George I of England. As I said, Anne's reign was pretty stable. She was a friend and correspondent of Jonathan Swift. She also had a war during her rule. It was called Queen Anne's War, and this war was fought in North America, but it was part of a larger struggle called the War of the Spanish Succession, which we'll get into a little bit later. But here is where the English start to really assert control over Canada and will eventually take Canada during the French, or what we call the French and Indian War. What is the legacy of the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution? Well, first of all, it really begins the rise of Parliament's power. Today, Parliament runs England, not the Queen. The Queen, as I said, is largely a figurehead, as ceremonial, and um, advises, and basically that's about it. Ireland is the tragedy of this. It becomes a place of persecution, a place of religious strife, a place of penal laws, a place where the Irish culture, the Irish language, the Irish customs are going to be suppressed and eventually almost erased. It'll become a place where Irish can only grow one particular crop for themselves, the potato, and that is going to have a real tragedy for the Irish people. This is also basically the end of the Stuart realm. James II decided he had had enough and retired to a monastery. He leaves the saving of the family dynasty to his son, James Francis Stuart, who is nicknamed the Old Pretender, and James Francis Stuart's son, Charles Edward Stuart, the Young Pretender, also known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. And he is featured in the Showtime series Outlander, which my wife absolutely loves to watch. The constitutionalism that is brought about during the Civil War and Glorious Revolution lays the groundwork for the American political system. Most importantly, the Bill of Rights that William III, William of Orange, assents to in 1689. It limits the powers of the monarch. It sets out the rights of Parliament, including the requirement for regular parliaments, free elections, and freedom of speech in Parliament. It sets out certain rights of individuals, including the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, and confirmed that Protestants have the right to bear arms for their defense, suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. I smell a Second Amendment in there. It also includes no right of taxation without Parliament's agreement. Dare I say, taxation with representation. The Bill of Rights joins Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, and the Parliament Acts later on of 1911 and 1949 as some of the basic documents that make up the uncodified British Constitution. Remember, the American Constitution, it's on parchment paper. We have a document, and then we have the successive amendments. The English do not have a document. Instead, they have what essentially is a file cabinet full of documents in there. There's other documents as well, the King's Coronation Oath, and so forth. But this is the foundation of the American political system. This is the foundation of the constitutional Republican system that we enjoy in this country to this day.